Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm doing a commentary video, talking about the making of the sorta new, but not that new anymore album from 256 Pi, called Real Life and Postcard Use. Yeah, finally about time I did this video, huh? I felt like I needed to get this out before the end of the year. For those who might be newer to the channel and confused as to what's going on here, first of all, yeah, I've been releasing my own original music as 256 Pi for a long time. And I haven't been doing any, like, ironic joke music or anything. I make music totally sincerely because I have fun doing it, and I've been doing it way longer than I've done any of this YouTube stuff. Technically, I've been making music for about 20 years now. I am counting stuff I made when I was a literal child as part of that. Some stuff that old is still publicly available on both my Bandcamp page and on my other channel, 256 Pi Music, in the form of various demo sessions. Mostly for the sake of, you know, hopefully helping other budding artists gain perspective and feel better about what they do when they first start out. But that's beside the point. Obviously, this past January I released my 9th full-length studio album called Real Life and Postcard Use, which is available on Bandcamp. It's available here on this YouTube channel in the form of that visualizer video I did, and on all the major streaming services, except for Spotify. By the way, I finally figured out how to take all my music off of Spotify, so you cannot listen to my music there anymore, so thank goodness for that. Really should have done that years ago when they changed their policy to literally take 100% of all my revenue forever. But I suppose running ICE recruitment ads certainly helped as an extra motivator to, you know, actually deal with DistroKid's stupid AI chatbots and get my stuff out of there. Anyway, most of my music is based around assembling stuff together out of, like, absolute tons of royalty-free sample packs. In the earliest days of my making music, I was just putting together really simple stuff out of, like, the stock loops that came pre-packaged with GarageBand and Acid Music Studio. Though as the years went by, I kept collecting more and more sample packs, and now I have, like, literal tens of thousands of loops and samples on my computer. Also in 2016, I picked up FL Studio, started using that more regularly in my music as well to, you know, like, add more original compositional elements and software synths, so I could, like, come up with my own melodies and stuff and add that on top of all the loops and samples. And yeah, I think I have improved a decent bit since, you know, I was a 10-year-old. For the first 10 or so years of me doing this music thing, I had basically no audience at all aside from, you know, people I knew in real life, like my family, my one real-life friend, my computer class teacher. And when I finally found an audience through trying to introduce my music to my viewers from this channel, I think a lot of people started out pretty skeptical of what I was doing. But whether or not anyone else was into it, I still kept at it anyway because I was always having a lot of fun with it, and I felt like I've just gotten better and better at it over time. Anyway, as for why this video even exists, I also started up a bit of a tradition for myself about 7 years ago now, over on the 256 Pi Music channel, where I would also do commentary videos like this one, like breaking down my thoughts on each of my main albums, talking about the process of making them, and maybe doing like a self-review type thing, because, I don't know, I thought that would be fun. Those videos did start out pretty awkward, out of me not being sure whether this would even be the kind of thing people would want to hear, and I did like a lot of unnecessary self-deprecating and like putting my work down out of thinking, oh, that would make me look more objective or something, and though I think I just kind of did more to like highlight my insecurity and stuff. But all those videos went over pretty well with my audience at the time, and as I got more comfortable actually talking about my own music and, you know, subscribing more to the Open Mike Eagle approach of normalizing liking your own shit in public, I think some pretty interesting discussion came out of it. I do have the playlist of all my old commentary videos linked in the description for anyone who happens to be interested, though for those who can't be bothered to watch a bunch bunch of old videos and might still be interested in looking into my deeper back catalog, seeing as this new album was a lot of people's first time hearing my music at all, I've also decided to include a semi-brief rundown of my previous discography so far. Really in brief segments. If you're already a longtime follower and you want to get straight to the discussion on the new album, you can skip to this time code. But hey, I thought this would be interesting and or helpful for those of you newer around here who might be intimidated at the amount of work I've put out over the years and wanted to figure out where to start or what might interest them. So how about we get into that? Here's my thoughts on the music I've put out so far. Okay, this is an album I originally made when I was 12 years old using nothing but the stock loops that came pre-packaged with Acid Music Studio. It definitely sounds like something an orbital-obsessed child came up with, but as someone who has long subscribed to the mindset that, technical ability does not directly correlate to quality, I do still love listening to this. It makes me feel like a little kid again without any of the parts of my childhood that make me cringe as, might be present in other stuff I made in that really early era. There's just an unencumbered, playful innocence to it, frozen in time like a big building made out of Duplo Legos, and it's not trying to pass itself off as anything other than what it is. I do obviously understand the people to whom the obvious amateurishness and reliance on stock loops were a turnoff, and I'm not going to call it like my best work, but I did put my absolute heart and soul into it at the time. It holds a lot of sentimental value. I think there is a special vibe I can get out of it that I can't get anywhere else. I still come back to it all the time, and it still holds up well enough for me where I'm not at all embarrassed by it being out there for the world to see. Okay, this is something of a transitional moment for me and what I feel to be the least essential of my main albums. I have come to terms with it fitting in my album catalog since it acts as like kind of a midway step in this early period trilogy of albums and a point where I was getting more ambitious with the ideas I was trying to accomplish even if I didn't have the technical ability to pull them off yet. It's a step forward for me in some regards, like I was coming up with more of my original tunes with the synth presets in GarageBand that don't rely as much on loops. And I do enjoy each of the individual tracks enough where I feel like the potential for a solid and consistent album was there, but I was still using GarageBand on a handful of tracks here, and that program comes with some major production limitations. And B, more glaringly, I had a habit early on of equating longer songs with being better and more meaningful, resulting in my always wanting to draw things out. Which I think really did not do the pacing on this thing any favors, especially closer to the end. I may have other albums that go on for much longer than this, but I feel like the other ones are better justified than this. A track like Grand View from the Dome, meanwhile, has no business being over 7 minutes, let alone over 8 on the non-remastered version. I don't dislike this album by any stretch. All the pieces are there for it to work, but it is the one that frustrates me the most to look back on. I feel like I could do so much better with the exact same core ideas if given one more pass at it. Now this one I view to be kind of my spiritual debut, and the first album to really feel like a 256 Pi album. I even went on record saying it was my favorite of my albums for a long time. I don't feel quite as strongly about it as I used to, and it has fallen in my ranking in more recent years, with newer albums approaching similar ideas with a lot more intentionality. I used to come back to this one the most for its ability to reduce my anxiety, and the newest one now serves the same purpose way more effectively. But even with all that in mind, I still have a soft spot for this one. It was the first time I nailed down a cohesive vibe that carried through the whole project, with this whole moody but playful, loungy electro jazz kind of feel that I felt like I could call my own, even if I kind of got there on accident. It sets up a fleshed out musical environment I can immerse myself in that reminds me of the days when my family would take me out to downtown Chicago as a kid without feeling too dragged out. And it still has some of my personal favorite tracks I've ever made to this day, like Secondhand Beats, Hexagonal Topography 1, and Cotangent. I can understand the people who could not get into the quirky fake jazz sound, and or thought the loops I chose were still too stock feeling to be palatable, but I still fully stand behind it and continues to just make me happy whenever I listen to it. Okay, we're through the early period trilogy from the days before I had an internet connection. This is the first 256 Pi album to have a cohesive vision on purpose, and the point at which my albums start having their own identities apart from each other beyond just being compilations of stuff I did within a given year. Oh, by the way, quick little side note, this album and the two albums after it, I just put together brand new album artwork for those albums out of, like, you know, photos I took, and in this case also this old fractal rendering program. The covers for these albums used to just be, like, existing art I downloaded from a free wallpaper site with my name slapped on it, but I never actually got permission to use. Now that my music's getting a little bit more actual attention, I felt like I needed something better. The music itself has not changed in any way, though. Anyway, I digress. This album shows me really leaning into my downtempo and ambient influences. Kind of a loose concept about exploring some endlessly huge computer-generated environment, aided by a lot of field recordings from, like, nature and cities and stuff, bookending each track. I felt like I had figured out how to make tracks that went on much longer without feeling forced here, loosely inspired by prog and psychedelic jam bands and stuff. And the fact that I could do that now excited me so much that it inevitably led to an album that runs on for over an hour and a half. So that is obviously not going to be for everyone, and I would get it if this got to be too much, but honestly, I feel the length on this one less than I do on Dark Clouds. At least here the arrangements were like naturally designed for that scale instead of just stretching out the same sets of loops for ages. Marble Jar has more sentimental value for me and better melodic hooks in my opinion, but this was a big step forward for my arrangement abilities and I still think it'll hold up quite well. And later that same year I also put this out as a direct contrast to the more open-ended vibe-centric approach the last album had. I tried for something more direct that focused more on my love for dance music with an emphasis on like disco and funk as well as a bunch of like movie soundtracky stuff since I was like really inspired by artists like Hybrid at the time. I did used to consider this one of my weakest albums, mainly out of finding it to be kind of uneven with certain cuts being able to hit way bigger heights than others, and the attempt at a continuous mix being pretty clunky. But in more recent years, this one's grown back on me since there is a specific sound to this one that none of my stuff before or since quite replicates in the same way, especially the funk and disco-y stuff. And it also gets some power from being my first album to actually reach any kind of audience on the internet thanks to my using some of these tracks in my YTPs at the time. So there's a decent amount of nostalgia for that particular era too, both on my part as well as for some of my longtime followers who had this as their jumping on point. Anyway, hope you still like long albums, because next I made a near 2-hour double album. My biggest scale work yet, with a mostly down-tempo and ambient-centric first half, and a more hard-hitting techno, breakbeat, and movie soundtrack-inspired second half, with the two discs directly mirroring each other in structure, and tied together in a very loose narrative concept as if the whole thing were like a soundtrack to a feature-length sci-fi anime film in my head. I have gone back and forth with my feelings on this one at times. I think my enjoyment of it is directly proportional to how often I go outside for walks and stuff, but I'm back to feeling like it was my best work up to that point and one of my best albums overall. This was the point at which I really figured out how to like do transitions between tracks and specifically arrange tracks to segue into each other. This was also the point at which I started using FL Studio for some tracks to come up with original non-sample based tunes, which some viewed to be a downgrade in sound, but was still me gaining more control and intentionality over what I was doing. I even brought in outside collaborators to help me for the first time. Two artists I met through the YTP community, Opus 84, now known as Miraposa, and DJ Dooms, now also known as QB. They were brought on as guest features that I think went over really well. And I think the overall experience is varied, immersive, and digestible enough for the length to feel justified for me. And again, I do understand the people who weren't a fan now thinking it was way too overlong or even just kind of uninteresting for them, but I think it is a good sign that all the people who didn't mess with it could all find at least one track they liked, and every single person I saw picked a different favorite. So yeah, I think right now that is my second favorite of my old albums. Oh yeah, in between a lot of these main albums, there's also kind of a side story going on with all those compilations I uploaded exclusively to Bandcamp, which were all just thrown together collections of stuff I made within any given year. When I first set up my Bandcamp page all the way back in 2012, all of the releases on there were still being treated as albums. But at some point in 2016, I tagged certain favorite projects of mine as main albums, and the rest as compilations in order to make my catalog more easily digestible for someone coming across my work for the first time. Most of the projects marked as compilations are as messy and inconsistent as they come, but there was also a ton of stuff I was still proud of on all of those comps as well. So, as part of the 10-year anniversary of Bubble Machine in 2018, I put together this compilation of what I felt to be all the very best tracks from all of those comps in order to make them available on major streaming services. And I have also just recently put this comp on Bandcamp as well because major streaming services suck. I think some of my best work can be found here, so I think it's as important to mention as any main album. Anyway, next is this weird one. For this album, I decided to really put myself out of my comfort zone, not only focusing much less on my usual sample-based methods, way more on like purely original FL Studio compositions. Not only paring things down to a way tighter 40-minute experience compared to the hour-long stuff I was usually doing, but also making a massive leap into including my own vocals filtered through vocoders and writing songs with actual lyrics about like my personal insecurities following my graduation from college and feeling like I was getting stuck in life over some 90s deep house and synth pop inspired arrangements. It is by far the highest effort and most difficult to make work I had made up to that point. Still, I would say the most difficult work I've made so far. Especially thanks to the fact that writing lyrics was so antithetical to the way I thought about music. Effectively communicating my inner feelings through words and phrases that rhymed was just not something that came naturally to me, but I still got something together that I was happy with and didn't feel like embarrassed by. The results did get a very mixed response from my audience at the time though. Like, a lot of people messed with it, finding the tunes to be catchy and the lyrics to be relatable, but just as many people outright disliked or even actively hated it, finding my dorky and stilted vocal presence to be unlistenable and the house instrumentals to be distastefully bland. On a personal level, I still stand behind it being the best I could have gotten it to be within my abilities at the time. I have no regrets in the way I went through with it. I think it was a necessary album for me to make. It expanded my abilities as well as my perspective on what it takes to make this kind of thing. I learned a lot from it, and I think all of it comes together well enough for what it is, especially still really like the second half of it. Though I'm also not interested in making another album like it ever again. Not because of the mixed reception, but because, again, I didn't enjoy the process of writing lyrics at all. And it put me into like such a self-loathing headspace. So yeah, it's probably not a good starting point to get into my work, but I do still like this album. I still think it's good. Although the desire for a more indicative starting point to get into my work also partially led to this album. In direct contrast to 04's really careful planning and stripped-back approach, for this album I decided to get looser and weirder, make my sound design denser and more out-of-the-box, delve into all sorts of different genres and moods, from drum and bass to breakbeat to IDM to ambient to trance and everything in between, and tie all of it up in a conceptual framework directly about my experience living with ADHD. Intentionally making the whole thing feel kind of fragmented and messy to directly fit with that theme. Also loosely inspired by the crazy state of the world over the course of 2020. Out of my old albums, this is still probably my favorite since it just seems to encapsulate almost every facet of my sound at once, and I think makes for a really fun, wild ride. And despite being my sonically densest work up to that point, the whole thing was much breezier for me to make than 04. I was just having fun with it and not taking myself quite so seriously. It didn't really land with a major splash immediately upon its release, but it seems to have like snuck up on people over time. Like, it was really cool to see the reception slowly turn from, I guess this is cool, in the beginning, to seeing more and more actual enthusiasm for it filtering in over the course of the following years. So yeah, that was really cool. So that finally brings us to here. Yeah, I know that's a lot to go through. I have released a lot of music. Anyway, as for this latest album, as you may surmise from the fact that it only came out after 4 entire years, the longest span of time between any two of my main albums to date, the process of this one went a little differently from the norm for me. I knew immediately after Noontide's Eidetic Drifter that I wanted my next album to be more ambient-centric as a contrast to the wilder and goofier tone of that album, though I didn't know what exactly I was going to be doing for a bit. The album title, Real Life and Postcard Use, had stuck in my mind for a long time, though. That is obviously a misheard lyric from the Kraftwerk track Europe Endless, that made me think that they were making some, like, deadpan joke, when the actual line was Postcard Views, which did technically make more sense, given the song was about, like, the beauty of Europe and stuff, but I wasn't sure which reading I liked more. Now, I'd originally given the title of Real Life and Postcard Use to, like, this one loose demo track that I made way back in the lead up to Noontide Side Attic Drifter. The track in question was just kind of like this clanky synth piece I threw together in FL Studio one afternoon in the need of an outlet to vaguely process my feelings shortly after Florian Schneider's passing. Kinda loosely, melodically mirroring Europe Endless, but also kinda making my own tune out of a similar idea. And then after finishing, I wasn't really sure how I felt on it. I briefly considered deleting it, but I've also never been one to delete projects, so I just ended up tacking it on to the end of a 256 Pi Music session, which itself was just kind of a disconnected collection of mostly unrelated ideas already. I did really like the title, and almost thought leaving that idea in the form that it was kind of a waste, but I didn't think I had anywhere else to go with it. Although a few years later, I really got into the Reed Willis album, Sediment. And my favorite part of that album was just its solo piano intro, First Grain. That album got, and still gets, so many repeat visits out of me just wanting to hear that intro and just let the rest of the album play out as is. Which also gave me the inspiration to look back at that old Real Life and Postcard Use demo and think, you know what? Maybe this could work better as like a solo piano intro, like First Grain did. That would do a much better job of like actually capturing the feelings I had, you know, reading the news about Florian back then. So I figured out how to like play the track on my really old Casio electronic keyboard over the course of several months. I did have piano lessons when I was like a really little kid, although I am very much out of practice at this point, so it did take a while to like get back in the hang of it, I guess. But at some point in 2024, while I want to say a little less than half of the final album was finished, I got myself a new, better sounding piano VST to replace the old kind of more MIDI-ish house piano I liked using before on the previous 3 albums. I also pulled out this other crappy MIDI keyboard here that I got from, like, a friend of my brother, I think. That, unlike my bigger, more functional one, I could actually plug into my computer and FL Studio could recognize as an input. Although, I wasn't really prepared for how it was going to handle, since it turned out there was, like, a quarter-second delay between pressing a key and actually getting a note to play in FL Studio. Which might not sound like much on paper, but that's enough to feel like the computer is, like, actively behind where your hands are, and makes it completely impossible to perceive timing. Like, you can just hit like a random key and it would go like, do. It was like that long of a pause. So what I did was I actually played the piece on the keyboard with no sound. I just took my headphones out and played it visually. Then I made minor adjustments in the piano roll in FL Studio to make it sound more natural after the fact. I could do like small corrections with like timing and the volume of notes to like vary them so that it would sound more natural and like I wasn't freaking out. So that worked, but needless to say, with that setup being all I had to work with, that also ended up being the only track on the album that I actually physically played a keyboard on. The pianos elsewhere on the album were either from sample packs or me inputting stuff directly into FL Studio's piano roll without the keyboard. So, yeah, that's the story of how this album's intro and title track came to be. Technically the first track on the album I came up with, and I finished it sometime in, like, the middle of developing the album as a whole. Although its existence does feel a little separate from the process of making the rest of the album. I feel like the first steps towards realizing the album didn't really come until I put together a session of music for the 256 Pi Music channel in 2021 called Parallelogram Season. Now, so the vast majority of sessions of music that I upload to that channel, including the ones I made after this one, the main purpose of those is to, like, throw ideas that I might have at the wall and see what sticks with my audience. I do loosely structure all of them as if they could be digested as albums or EPs in their own right, since that's just how I used to treat them back in the days before I had regular internet access. But as my greater back catalog got way too big to be a reasonable ask for anyone to sit through, the sessions took on a new meaning as being a way for me to draft new ideas in the lead-up for main albums. Usually I can put together one session over the course of like 2 days or so, though Parallelogram Season was different since all of the tracks within that session each had a full session's worth of effort put into it. There were only 4 tracks, inspired by a series of 4 season-themed oil paintings that my grandmother has hanging up on the wall in her living room, which I used as the cover artworks. But each of those 4 tracks stretched on for well over 10 minutes and each took a couple of days to put together. All of them very slowly building from pure ambience into harder-hitting dance arrangements, loosely trying to recapture and refine the style I explored way back on my Inside the Mainframe album. And all of them being what I felt to sit among the very best work I had ever made up to that point. Especially the opening track from that session, Primavera, which, a month after I'd released the session, I think I was like, this is the best track I've ever made. The way it went from nothing but light pianos and field recordings and escalated slowly enough one might not even notice it transforming into a full-on drum and bass banger, loosely inspired by really early Pendulum and tracks of theirs like Sounds of Life and Plastic World. Not even getting into how the other tracks in that session made similar progressions, like the track Verano ascended from abstract guitar loops into punchy, mildly EDM-flavored deep house-ish drops, I guess. The track Otoño had all these psychedelic dub meanderings, and Invierno had a build from icy minimal IDM into harder-hitting psytrance passages. I was really proud of that section when I was done, and I had started to think, well, what am I even going to do with this stuff now? Is this, a regular album? It could be, but it doesn't feel quite right. It was large scale, but not large scale enough. Also, I had just come off the heels of a new album, and I didn't want to cut into that. Was it an EP? Not really, since the 4 tracks add up to just under an hour, and I didn't really want to do the Oudaker thing of marking album-length projects as EPs. Was it a side project under a different alias? No, it feels like a 256pi thing to me. So I just settled on making it a session and dumping it on 256pi Music out of thinking, well, maybe this way I can, repurpose some of this into a main album later down the line. Although as proud as I was of the material on that session and how I felt like it almost acted as a level up of my production abilities, one of the earliest decisions I made about the final album was that I did not want it to break an hour. Only 2 of my previous albums are shorter than an hour, being Bubble Machine and 044444. The others mostly sit around the 70-minute mark. Mostly out of my personally being used to the structuring provided by what could be included on the length of one CD. I've talked about that being closer to a sweet spot of mine when it comes to album lengths, how the vast majority of my favorite albums of all time are CD-era records that made full use of the sprawl that their format allowed, and feel like they really set up a musical world and immersed you in it. And if you do double CDs right, that can be even better, hence the existence of Spiral Out of Control. Though the length of my old albums is one of the single most common criticisms that people have sent my way over the years. As much as I love long albums, most people very much do not agree with me on that front. Most people prefer something snappier for you to just get in and get out without wasting too much of their time. And seeing an album is 70 minutes will be enough for lots of people to just skip out altogether and not even give it a chance on principle. So yeah, even if it slightly goes against what I enjoy the most in this genre, keeping things short was one of the underlying goals I set for myself for this new album. And as a result of that, the only track from Parallelogram Season to actually make the cut for this album was Primavera. I knew that track had to be on a main album, and when I eventually edited down for the 9.5-minute final album version years later, I also punched up the arrangement a bit and made it even more dense and detailed than it already was, with an entire new bridge section in the middle that wasn't originally there, that had this whole I guess, symphonic hip-hop inspired flavor to it, semi-inspired by the track Clubbed to Death by Rob Dugan, if you've ever heard that before. I think I do still prefer the original 13-minute version just a tiny bit, since it's just easier to, like, lose myself in its atmosphere, while the final version has a very slight sense of me trying to, like, rush through the same ideas with a bit less impact, but I mean, it's not like I thought the album edit lost that impact. I think it is very much still there, and finishing that edit was also, like, one of the most exciting feelings I had in the process of making this album. And the fact that I ended up with the kind of arrangement that made 9.5 minutes feel like it zipped by in 3 minutes. Not just for myself, but other people have told me they've felt the same thing about it as well. That was awesome. The rest of Parallelogram Season was a bit too large scale for me to be able to fit anything else from there on the album, though since I still consider those other 3 tracks some of my very best to date, as well as being inspired from, like, getting one comment from somebody who told me they personally found the other 3 tracks on that session to hit on a properly transcendental level for them, and not Primavera. When I saw that comment, I was like, you know, I think it would be a good idea to, like, include, like, a mini mix of those 3 tracks from the session as a bonus included in the Bandcamp download. So yeah, that is why that's there. While Parallelogram Season was a big turning point for me and the way I make music, it was also kind of like a false start in terms of the process of actually making this album. After making that session, I also got hit with, I guess, producer's block or something, and I wasn't making music for a while. The only music I put out in 2022 was the original soundtrack I made for one of my own YTPs, which was a whole other headache and a half, tying together my music process with my YTP process. While I got something out of it eventually, also actively made things more difficult for me both on the YTP end and the music end, and I lost a lot of motivation for both. But then came 2023. 2023 was particularly impactful for me in the worst way, since early in that year, the company that I had been working at for my day job went out of business, and I got laid off. I would not be able to find a new day job until near the end of 2024, and my only consistent source of income in that near 2-year time span was this very YouTube channel. I am more back on my feet now, but needless to say, this entire span of time was absolutely dehumanizing, especially as this was around the time that, like, more and more companies were integrating AI into the job search process to, like, just obfuscate everything even further, and the market became, like, increasingly impossible to navigate, though I don't want to go off on a whole tangent about that, oh my god. And even though being unemployed technically meant I had more spare time, it didn't mean I had time for 4 entire Some Stuff I Missed roundups that year, which I kinda don't think is ever gonna be happening again if I'm being brutally honest. For anything other than music reviews, my motivation had absolutely crashed, and every process I had for making other things slowed down even further. I couldn't even pretend like I was doing okay in any way over the course of that year. But some good did technically come out of it. For one thing, being in these circumstances led me to want to get back to making music purely as a means of cheering myself up and reminding myself to keep breathing and keep living to see another day. It gave the album all the more extra meaning, and I had a mission with it now. Also, after such a long time of, being like a really introverted, shut-in kind of guy who didn't like leaving his room all that much, I did start to gain interest in, going outside on walks. I was, actually getting some exercise to give myself some time away from social media and the doom and gloom of the world. Touching some grass, as it were. I also took up taking photos with my phone on those walks, getting pictures of stuff outside that looked mildly interesting or that could make for a possibly good album cover. And over the course of those 2 years, I took over 2,000 photos to pick from. Now, for a long time, the cover I was planning to use looked like this. Used a photo I took in the Chicago Botanic Gardens, and I was structuring it to look like the 2000s Ultimate Records covers with the black bars as an homage to that entire label being another pretty direct inspiration on the direction that I took with the whole thing. Although I eventually did away with the Ultimate Records of black bars out of, not wanting to do some kind of trademark infringement. I don't think their 2000s cover design is actually trademarked. I don't know if you can trademark that, but I didn't want to step on their toes if I could help it, or make it look like I had been signed to Ultimate Records when I hadn't actually been. So that ended up like getting just manifested as like loose references in the CD packaging, as well as the visualizer video ended up doing. And I also ended up doing away with the Botanic Garden photo much later, after I found out on their website that technically you need to pay a license to use photos taken there in a commercial setting, which is some bullshit. The good news is that I ended up landing on a different picture for the cover, which was frankly way better looking than the one I had initially planned to use. The real cover I took in 2024 while I was all the way out in Richmond, Virginia for my cousin's wedding. I was just kind of like, wandering around the area to like take a breather from an ongoing pre-wedding party. And I just happened to come across that whole pipeline structure overlooking the river, which was like one of the coolest looking views that I had ever seen in my life. I think I made the right call going with that as the final cover. But yeah, I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. So, over the course of 2023, I made 3 more sessions of music, going back to the usual scale that I was at pre-parallelogram season, and specifically meant to give me more material to work with for this main album. So first, in July 2023, I made a session called Hydrologic Outlook, named after a phrase I saw in the weather app on my phone once on a day that just had really crap weather. I thought, that looks like it would be a cool song title. So that session came a little before I started going on my regular walks, but I used a whole bunch of cool overcast photos that I took at a power station, which pretty much just exemplified the mood I was in for much of that year up to that point. I did not give any of the tracks on that session titles. I just kind of made some shit up as I went along over the course of a couple of days, and ended up with 26.5 minutes of dark and rainy IDM and ambient techno flavored stuff. The track of the same title that made the cut for the album, that was a mix of the ideas of parts 5 through 8 of that session. The synth arpeggios in part 5, I knew pretty immediately were going to be some kind of more exciting drop to start everything off. The Part 6 had some jazzier piano elements I thought were cool. I ended up working those in. Part 7 really leaned into the glitch effects and built them up to the highest levels. And part 8 was a borderline noise piece, is a kind of this exhale and outro kind of thing. The final album version was one of the tracks here that took me the longest to really nail down. I spent a lot of time tweaking and trying to figure out the best way to get it to stand out, not feel redundant, I guess. Initially, the track stuck a lot more faithfully to what you hear on the session with little to no beats, and I was feeling like maybe it was in danger of weighing down the pacing a tiny bit. Though what eventually got it to click was bringing in this kind of big beat-ish break beat and just putting that on top of the final glitchy IDM session. So then that made that whole part go hard as hell, so that was really fun. I'd also kind of considered for a while to include part 9 of that session as making the cut for the main album, since that cut is kind of the emotional culmination of that entire session. It was a piano piece based entirely around a sample of hold music that I recorded off my phone one day while I was waiting in a queue for a full hour to get my freaking Medicaid benefits renewed. Somehow that piano loop I heard for what felt like the entire day it was pretty nice, and I didn't get sick of hearing it, so I ended up loosely remaking the loop in FL Studio and built a whole track around it. And that track did not make the cut for the album out of not having room for it with the less than hour limit and feeling like it might be redundant style-wise. And also given the album's overall flow and pacing was such a top priority, tracks that could form more the core backbone of the album and drive momentum and stuff, those took more precedence. I probably could have found a way to make some good segues with that whole music track, but I wouldn't have been able to put it somewhere that wouldn't have made it feel kind of like a digression. It works best as an ending to that session, and at that point I did already know exactly what I was going to be doing with the main album's endings, but I will get to that much later. Though a much bigger step towards forming the backbone of the album came with the next session I put together the following September, simply called 2, because on this one road trip, I forget where we were going, I just came across a building that had a 2 on it and got a photo of it. Also, it was the second session I put out that year. This session was the first one to come out of my actually going outside more often, where the photos I was taking on walks were also starting to act more as direct inspiration for the music. It's also probably worth noting that part of the inspiration in this session came when the suburb I live in had like this really big smog cloud floating through it for a few days. A whole bunch of smoke from wildfires in Canada had floated all the way down to the Chicago area and made our air quality significantly worse than usual. On one of the days we had smog, I remembered I needed to like go out and take one of my family's cars to get an emissions test, but the car's air conditioning was broken, so I was needing to like open and close the car window every 30 seconds. Couldn't keep it open too long. I'd actively feel like I was losing oxygen, but couldn't keep it closed for too long or I would overheat. So that was fucking hell. So that really stuck in my memory. Obviously nothing compared to what I presume it's like if you live in California or something. As extremely all over the place and dog shit as Chicago's weather is, I feel like we're lucky to not really be facing the brunt of the world's climate crisis. But we were getting a more of an on-the-nose taste of the climate crisis than usual around that specific time. I also remember looking on the weather app on my phone on one of the days the smog was starting to clear up, and it said that the air quality was back up to the range of unhealthy for sensitive groups. And the second I saw the latter phrase, I knew I absolutely had to use that as a track title, because that just sounds like a cool track title. So, unhealthy for sensitive groups obviously ended up being one of like the big centerpiece tracks from that session. I had the title first and was like actively trying to capture the essence of that phrase and my little smog in the car experience. With a mix that both felt organic but also dark and foreboding, brought in a lot of like organic hand percussion loops on top of each other. So I took like two kind of similar sounding ones and panned one to the left ear and one to the right ear so like it would kind of feel like it was surrounding you. I also had this really freaking nice like dub adjacent bass line underscoring the whole thing, which kicked ass. And the final album version also combined the core idea of that track with a series of like minute-long sketches immediately from the same session, which I had originally called Geologic Pattern. For one of those sketches, I'd landed on this mix of like really heavy old-school dubstep bass pattern that I combined with some glitch effects, and I would like switch them off with some samples of like some woman making wordless vocalizations like doo 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 doo, which ended up being really catchy. Also, the last of the sketches had like this big tempo switch up and epic ramp up in energy so that I'd be able to transition into a new unrelated idea. That whole ramp up bit made it into the album version of the track near verbatim as well. The pieces fit together so well that Unhealthy for Sensitive Groups was the very first track on the main album that I finalized and fully nailed down within like a couple of days in early 2024. Though, speaking of pieces fitting together really well, something else that I knew almost immediately after finishing it was almost certainly going to be on the album was the pair of cuts that opened the same session, originally just titled To and Nowhere, respectively, but I eventually combined together the ideas of and gave it the better title of Foliage Adieu. You know, like the phrase foliage adieu, but, you know, with leaves, foliage, and adieu as in farewell. I don't know. It just popped in my head random one day, and I was like, oh, that's kind of clever, and it fit the vibe of the track. Anyway, when I finished this session, I knew pretty much immediately that the album was going to start proper with a new version of 2, followed by a new version of Unhealthy for Sensitive Groups. Those two tracks may not sound much like each other. One is like this bright and uplifting ambient house adjacent tune, and the other is like a dark and foreboding dub-inspired thing. But the stream of consciousness approach that I have to putting together tracks on sessions these days meant that these two tracks were inseparable from each other. Unhealthy for Sensitive Groups starts with the exact same selection of sample loops as the very end of its preceding track, but with the tempo turned down. And the main bass line that runs through the entire first half of Unhealthy for Sensitive Groups also runs through the entire second half of Foliage Adieu, but sped up there. Also much later in development, I had also added on like a little piano solo in the background that carried over the transition between the two cuts and added on a little extra flourish, I guess. Stuff like this is kind of the secret to getting the most seamless possible continuous mixes, even when there's as much stylistic variety as there is on this album. it's all in like the songwriting and specifically crafting the songs themselves to have these segues in mind. With enough planning, a transition between tracks can already be underway like a full minute or longer before the end of a track, and almost every track on this thing had me like very specifically keeping in mind how they were eventually going to segue out of each other as I was initially putting them together. But anyway, when it came to the final album version of Foliage to Do, there were a few notable developments. First of all, this is the first ever track I made to include synth settings I designed myself through the Citrus synth in FL Studio. The melody of the track in the original 2 demo was like one fairly lengthy sample loop that, while pretty nice sounding, and I did really like the tune of it, also felt like a little strange sounding when sped up. So I recreated the melody from scratch in FL Studio and figured out how to use Citrus to make my own synth settings, since I felt like that is a thing that it really should have been learning how to do for a while. It does turn out Citrus is very much not an easy or intuitive synth to start learning this thing. I pretty much just chose to start with it because I had already been like regularly using Citrus preset settings in old tracks going back as far as like when I first started using FL Studio. Thought that would like keep the continuity of the way I handled my sound, I guess. And so that turned out to be a little complicated to work with, but I looked up on some tutorials on YouTube trying to figure out what to do and got, a couple of pretty nice sounding melodic tones. There was one that kind of sounded like a little synth harp-like, and another that kind of sounded a little clarinet-like or something, so using those ended up amping up that track pretty nicely. But obviously I'm kind of talking around the much bigger story about Foliage to Do, in that it turned out to be one of the 2 tracks I made the exceedingly rare move of bringing in an outside collaborator to help me. Now, I'm a pretty socially awkward guy in real life who doesn't really like talking to people. Shocker, I know. So collaborations are not something I attempt very often, unless I feel like I already have like a well-established good relationship with the people in question, and the idea of contacting them for such a thing would feel less unnatural. Yeah, look at me describing how collaborations work. Both of the artists I brought in on this album were artists that I'd reviewed a number of times, and I had regularly been interacting with on like social media and the like. So for Foliage to Do, I talked to the artist Give Me Monaco. The track was already fairly directly inspired by his style in the first place. I've been listening to his particular blend of organic house and garage, especially through his Inferno and Luminance EPs, a lot around the time. That led me to want to make something in a similar vein myself, and feel like bringing him in just to build on this track would be the perfect fit. And when I hit him up about it, he was like, oh yeah, I'd be more than happy to participate, and that just made me so happy. So yes, Give Me Monaco is responsible, first of all, for putting together all the percussion loops that were eventually used in the final version. He was loosely inspired by Burial while putting them together, giving that little slight garage bounce to these beat patterns. I also initially gave him the intro of the track, which comprises the first minute and 15 seconds without any beats, so that he could like directly continue off of the idea I had. He came up with that little mini bridge of filtering the lead melody through some like swishy effects and building up into a low-key but cheerful drop section with some bright vocal chops and reprising some of the melody lines I already introduced. And it was perfect. It was exactly what I wanted to get this track to go the extra mile. We also kind of traded ideas for the outro section. As mentioned, I already knew the bass line and pads already had to be what they were so that they would segue as smoothly as possible into the next track. He initially wanted them to like mostly just leave them the way they were out of feeling they sounded good enough on their own, although he did add on a bit of muted synth drone and some new percussion patterns for that section to keep the momentum going, and I built off what he gave me to make that last bit where the beats restart and the melodies kind of come back together all at once. And I added in some low-key pianos in that bit much later to even further smooth out that transition. So yeah, that's how Foliage to Do came to be. I was really happy with the final result of this track, and knew once it was done that it was going to be the album's lead single. Give Me Monaco has since gone relatively inactive, mostly out of burnout with the process of trying to find an audience through independently releasing music. And I think you can only find his music on Bandcamp and related platforms now, not on the major streaming services anymore. I do hope a day comes when we get to hear more of his stuff, even if that turns out to be like a limited low-key release on Bandcamp or something to that effect, since his stuff has really come to grow on me and mean something special. I think he did find a way to feel like a legit standout talent for me, even in the massively overcrowded market of straightforward house music in the 2020s. But I guess if our collab ends up being like one of the last things you hear from him in a long time, at the end of the day, I'm just so happy I got to work with him and that all of this saw the light of day. So, all of the shoutouts for him for coming in to help. It was a real pleasure to link up with him. So anyway, that was pretty much everything from the 2 session that ended up making the cut for the album. Now, much like with Hydrologic Outlook, I did once again have to leave the track from that session that was probably my personal favorite on the cutting room floor, for the same pacing and sequencing reasons I didn't include that one hold music track. That session also had a track called 10 Feet 6 Inches, which was like this really smooth and low-key piano jazz thing where I took a bunch of jazz piano loops and build some bass lines and string melodies from other completely unrelated sample packs and made them sound like they could have played together in the same band. I really loved the way it sounded, so I eventually ended up putting that track on its own separate bonus EP on Bandcamp, along with 2 demo versions of other tracks from this album I will get to later, and an alternate beatless version of 10 Feet 6 Inches I originally made in hopes of its inclusion on Neo Tantra's 7 Stages of Grief compilations as a tribute to the late Arnie Grittar. They ended up not using it though, so I gave it a home on that EP instead. The 2 session was also home to a pair of alright enough drum and bass tracks called Under the Underpass and Across the Underpass, which I only mentioned since even though they were never directly in consideration for inclusion on the album, I did end up taking the lead set of quirky synth riffs from there and ended up working them into the final album version of Primavera from the middle of its bridge section onwards. So that's another interesting thing to note. And that's finally everything notable to mention from that particular session. So that leaves the last public session of music I made in the lead-up to this album to talk about. At the end of October 2023, I put out the session Assisted Living. I got the title of this session from hearing my youngest brother talk about work he was doing at a nursing home. Apparently the assisted living is the place where people go when the facility deem them, not mentally sound or well enough to interact with the main crowd of old people. And then the staff equipped to work with those people was especially limited, so as a result, the assisted living ends up being a little something of a misnomer. That sounded pretty fucked up to me, and thinking of that, as well as being informed by the mood of various other photos I took of, buildings under construction at night and a large business park near me, that manifested in me being inspired to make some especially dark and chilling and isolated feeling techno and IDM material for that session. Now, once again, while making this session, I already had a good idea on how the segue out of Unhealthy for Sensitive Groups was going to go, so I made sure to set it to the same tempo and key as the end of that track, and made it fit as smoothly together as I could. And I threw a lot of different ideas at the wall for that session, and a whole bunch of them ended up being used for the final album version of the track Assisted Living, including but not limited to the title track from that session, which gave me the initial groove and bass synth stabs, which I thought hit particularly hard. There was a demo called Concrete that gave me the classic, TB303 acid parts I use in the middle bit of that track as well. Really satisfyingly filthy stuff, I guess. But there was one particular little stretch which stood out as the very easy highlight of that session and ended up being included on the album nearly entirely verbatim without changing or rearranging that much. So first of all, the entire second half of Assisted Living's album version is cut out of the demo from that session, which was originally called Unloading. The blend of harsh cinematic ambient pads I ended up cutting together for that bit just felt so epic and imposing and cosmic and huge sounding and enveloping that I knew it absolutely had to be on the final album. And also because of the way that track on the session transitioned into the following track, The Natural Path. When I was making that session, I was starting to feel like maybe I could use something lighter near the end to balance out all the darker stuff, so I took the same groove from the Unfolding demo, plopped a bunch of classic 90s break beats on top, which I got from this one, breakcore sample pack that I found through CFAX Acid Crew retweeting it one day, I think. So I took those break beats, I brought in some jazz piano loops and thicker bass line samples again, And the second I heard the way all those elements sounded on top of each other, I immediately fell in love with what I was hearing and knew for a fact this was going to be a major personal standout on the album. Yeah, the pianos are cut together out of like a fairly simple arrangement of like 7 different piano loops, but the way they sounded together, it just sounded so perfect the way they came in that, once again, I didn't feel like I needed to edit too much about them. I also got some more like vibraphone loops to build off their melodies, and those were even more perfect working off each other. There was a part of me who was worried how this track was going to go down, since the idea behind this track is really similar to what I did with the track Miles Per Hour from '04. It's got the same blend of musical ingredients from pianos and breakbeats and bits of vibraphones. Their bass lines even came from the same sample pack as each other, which, you know, was a sample pack of like 500 bass lines, but still. And this was a much simpler arrangement that wasn't nearly as epic or sprawling, but I felt like the tune and melody to The Natural Path was so strong it was more than able to just stand on its own separately from Miles Per Hour. There was just no reasoning with myself, it just had to be there. Before that point, I was still considering the whole music track for inclusion on the album. I was considering 10 feet 6 inches for the album, but once I finished the first draft of The Natural Path, I was like, no, this is the one that needs to fill this spot. I may have liked those other two a lot, but this one I just could not stop listening to and re-listening to it. I knew I had something special with this one. A track like this is a good example of why I still keep buying and using royalty-free sample packs even all these years later. For as stock and soulless as they're often purported to be, I do think it is still more than possible to mine something emotionally meaningful out of them that feels like it does have soul behind it. And that does require plenty of thought and effort and practice to know what you're looking for and find the right pieces to get to that point. But there's also like an explorative process to it where I can surprise myself at where I end up. Now, I knew while I was making the session that the only logical place for me to sequence the track was for it to lead right into Primavera, although I realized halfway into assembling it that I wasn't quite in the right key. The Natural Path and the second half of Assisted Living I think are both in F sharp, but Primavera is in G sharp. I could have transposed the track up, but A, I would have also had to transpose the previous couple of tracks in that section as well in order to retain the transition, and B, I'd gotten too accustomed to the way it sounded in F sharp, and through some quirks in the way Acid Music Studio works, it might have thrown off the mix balance of other elements in that part of the session. So what I did instead was sneak in a little key change. I turned it into like a kind of a dreamier, abstract ambient guitar thing at the end with some new piano patterns that I wasn't already married to the way they sounded in the previous key, and then I knew I could get that transition to work better. Also, for the eventual final album version, while I didn't really feel like I needed to change much about the way it was originally, I did decide to amp it up a bit through adding in some strings, and for those I did come up with a melody from scratch in FL Studio all by myself, so it's not all samples. So yeah, that's everything that made the cut and was in consideration from the publicly released sessions. By the point I finished the Assisted Living session, I had a good idea exactly the way the entire album was going to be mapped out. However, over the last several albums, I've made sure that I can also deliver a bunch of surprises for people that no one would have heard yet. So that leaves 3 tracks left to talk about which are entirely exclusive to this album. First, there's Dangerous Curve, the second of 2 collabs on this album, this one a crossover with none other than Vale Smith. This is a collab I've wanted to happen in some form for a long time, I'm gonna be honest. I've obviously been following him for years now, and you should be too. Both his music, which I've obviously covered in detail plenty of times since he started doing it, but also his YouTube channel as well. He's one of my favorite creators to watch on this platform as well. Even when, he's been doing more videos about, movies and video games lately than music, but they're all exactly as entertaining to watch as anything else. Guy can talk about seemingly anything and get an interesting discussion, and just be an entertaining presence to watch and listen to, I guess. And with how regularly we've been, interacting with each other over the years, and there even being public record of him saying that he'd be totally game for such a crossover when someone asked him about it in a Q&A once, this happening was almost a no-brainer for me. So as for how it all came together, It is kind of interesting to see some parallels with the two collabs on this album and the two collabs I did on Spiral Out of Control. Well, both of the crossovers on this album are closer to being like true 50-50 splits than the crossovers on that album, but both still have a bit of a slant on who contributed more. Foliage Ado, like the Opus 84 collab on Spiral, feels more my thing than Give Me Monaco's, and the way we worked together went pretty much exactly the way I envisioned it would, and he didn't really want to change that much with what I gave him. But Dangerous Curve, like the DJ Dooms collab on Spiral, feels more, almost kind of more like a Vale Smith track than my track, and I feel like he just totally went above and beyond what I went in expecting. Like, I knew the way I generally wanted this track to sound, but I didn't actually give him that much to work with. At least not as much as I did with Give Me Monaco. All I had initially put together of Dangerous Curve was, like, this unfinished demo, which comprised the first, like, minute and 20 seconds of the track. It was just the build-up in the intro, almost entirely made out of samples of this sample pack that I believe Hudson Lee put out once. I knew this track was going to lead out of Primavera and transition into Hydrologic Outlook, so I thought, well, if I want something that'll be able to really hit after such a hard-hitting epic beast like Primavera, after that track stops, maybe I can have something like a pregnant pause and take like a one-off darker detour and catch people off guard a little, have people like going like, oh, what's going on here? And then like, oh, okay. So I had these sound clips of like Hudson Lee banging on metal objects with some weird experimental sound effects in the background. And then that sample pack also had like these long clips of, I guess, evolving ambient pads that I just hard cut into a bunch of pieces and built up that way. And that was all I had. I sent that intro over to him and told him that this was going to be the build-up to some kind of drop to come afterwards, and that I tonally wanted him to do something in the same vein as what he did on his track, Itinerant But Still Nothing, on Yo. I kind of wanted something harsher and more experimental and out there, but I didn't really give him much direction outside of that. Just told him to go nuts and do whatever he so chose. And, I don't think anything could have possibly prepared me for what he would end up sending back to me about a week later. I just opened up the WAV file he sent over and it was immediately just like... First of all, the intro I gave him, he had even further amped up. He ran some of those metal banging sounds through like some effects and made them sound like even heavier and bassier and like more attention-grabbingly warped. And in the thick of that build-up, he also brought in like this weird spoken sample that sounded like a voicemail talking about, oh, I thought you were asleep. Brenda called about trading card pool on Thursday. I don't know if that's real or from a movie or something. And then came in his payoff to my build-up, which, oh my god, I'm just geeking out just thinking about it. I got treated as like the heaviest fucking bass I had ever heard in my life, just absolutely slamming me in the fucking face. Like 40 new layers of different crazy sounds and glitches scattering all over the place. And he even delivered 2 drops in his roughly minute-long continuation. He made another drop that felt like it was going even deeper and darker than the first one. Like the stem for the bass stabs in that bit he named Crazy Mode Bass. So I always think of that little bit as like the Crazy Mode bit. And it's worth noting that at the point I heard this, If You See a Blur had not been released yet. So I knew he had the potential to make crazy experimental stuff of this caliber, but there wasn't really much of that in his catalog at that point to compare it to, like Mask Man or Torn Dreams would show themselves to be shortly afterwards. So hearing this section for the first time almost felt like I was hearing him level up to yet another new tier for his sound design expertise on a track that I was personally directing. And even if he had done that leveling up on his own time, I cannot possibly describe how astronomically cool that was. I was just absolutely blown away just immediately, like, holy shit. So now the ball was in my court to figure out how the hell I was going to follow that up. I pretty much just tried my best to kind of match what he was delivering. In the very beginning bit, I did some more edits to the voicemail sample that he put in and did like some like YTP-style sus jokes. Like the sample used to say, oh, Brenda called, and then I edited so that it would say, Brenda called. And as for my continuation, I tried to create like a build-up and drop that directly mirrored what he gave me, but like pulling more from my own library of sounds, obviously. I did still keep a lot of the same percussion parts from his section so the groove would continue as it had, but I also took one of his percussion hits, like this kind of like vaguely bell-like sound, and I pitched it up and down to turn like a little melody sort of in the background. I brought in a bunch more atmospheric pads, also pulled out of some old sample packs that Ultimate Records founder Ace Dana put out back in the day, I believe. And I also layered in some new voicemails pulled directly from my phone, all from either spam calls or people calling me with the wrong number. There was someone who I think was trying to order a t-shirt, even though I've never sold those before. There was like a canned recording about your existing cell data plan qualifying for a discount. That kind of thing. So I spliced those in, and I cut up the pads in new ways. I layered like some glockenspiel loops over it and brought in like this glitchy beat percussion loop to top it all off. I think it all fit together cleanly enough where some people couldn't even tell where my bits began or ended. And that leaves the outro bit, which I sent back to Valesmith to figure out what he wanted to do. All I had was some of the pads from Hydrologic Outlook I knew I'd have to use for the transition and a reprise of sounds from my initial intro bits. It took a little while for him to nail something down, but when he got back to me, he said he decided that he, instead of going for something crazy and aggressive like the beginning parts, he was going to instead switch up into something more light and fun for the end. And when I saw his message saying this, I was thinking like, is this going to work? I don't know if light and fun is quite the tone I want for this track, but I will let him cook. I'm sure he will find a way to make that still feel like it can fit. And when I heard the results, I was like, oh yeah, that does feel like it would work. It was like a little bit lower energy than the rest of the track since he switched over to like some lighter garage style beat work, but he'd also brought in some like cool emotional string chops and these nice warmer piano melodies which ended up hitting quite well. Just for fun, I'll play what his vision for the outro sounded like. This is what he sent to me. So with that in my hands, while I was definitely happy with what he gave me, I decided, you know what would be cool is if I also add like some more to it and make this section like a half and half thing between us. So I ended up, like punching it up more myself to keep it more in line with kind of the banger-centric vision I originally had for the track. I took some of his percussion textures and buzzing bass from his beginning parts and cut them up to turn it into like a thicker and punchier kind of electro-flavored groove. I sped up one of his piano parts for like a background texture. I recreated another one of them with the custom synth settings I had set aside for Folia to do. I had like one of those little like mid-beat anticipation pauses to turn this last section into like one final little climactic drop. And to really make it go the extra mile, I also layered some of the sounds he left for me in that final transition section on top of the beginning of a Hydrologic Outlook. And once I had all of that together, I was like, it's done, this is perfect, and I think this was even like the last main track on the album to get completely finished, aside from like small mastering tweaks here and there. Either that or another one which I'll get to in a bit. And brief side tangent, I was really surprised at the handful of people who marked this track as like a lower point or even a least favorite. That felt pretty wild to me, though. I suppose that kind of lines up with how, like, when his Chorus Gate album was, like, really circulating around, I remember seeing, like, a surprising amount of people marking the track Veracity in the Warehouse as a lower point on there for, like, being too jumbled and out there, having the least of a solid tune. And I remember being, like, really thrown off by that, since that's, like, my, and many other people's, like, among the biggest favorite tracks on that album for the exact same reason. I guess some people are going to prefer, like, the more accessible stuff, and some people are going to prefer the more experimental stuff. It just depends on people's taste, I guess. In any case, I was beyond stoked that this collab finally happened and that the final results felt as mind-blowing to me as they did. So, with all that out of the way, that finally takes us to the album's very ending. The last track that I started work on for this album after all the other sessions were done was the penultimate track, Earthlight. And truth be told, out of all the tracks on this album, this is the one that most closely mirrors, I guess, the image I had in my head for what this album might sound like before I properly started work on it. Especially when I was putting together, like, the early Ultimate Records homage first draft album cover. This track, like, really nails down my love for that particular sound and era of psychedelic ambience from the 2000s. Your Solar Fields, Ace Dana, Carbon-Based Lifeforms, Asura, all the others. Just hitting you with, like, lots of big, expansive, melodic pads of various shapes and sizes that evoke, a vast sense of spaciousness, but can also feel very calming and delicate at the same time. Although I did initially struggle a bit with getting it to, like, really come together in a way that I was happy with. First, I threw together a 4-minute demo version assembled together out of another new really big sample pack of various ambient textures I had just downloaded. Made it the same key and tempo as the album's closing track, since I already had a working demo of that for a while and I knew it would have to segue. And the first version sounded nice enough, but it also didn't feel quite like it was nailing the level of quality I'd gotten to with other main tracks on the album, given it was just a first draft and the kind of thing that would have ordinarily been plopped into a greater session. So what I did instead was extend out that 4-minute demo to 10 minutes to allow myself a greater variety of ideas to look through, and then re-edited that 10-minute version back down to 4 minutes of just the best ideas I ended up coming across. It was like I made a mini session and abridged it, and when I nailed down that third draft, I was like, yeah, this is perfect, I knocked this out of the park. For those interested in hearing what the 10-minute version was like, I did include that on the 10 feet 6 inches EP on Bandcamp that I mentioned earlier. And that EP also has a demo version of the last main track on this album to talk about, the album closer, Anything Not Saved Will Be Lost. Where all these other tracks show me getting into my usual sample pack diving, this track I came up with the original tune myself. I actually had the title before anything else. I knew I wanted the album to finish with something life-affirming and a reminder to keep on living, since that's kind of the conceit of the album as a whole. And of course I named it after the common phrase that comes up when you close certain computer programs before saving your work, I guess. But the actual tune came to me in the same way that most of the tracks on 04 came to me, i.e. from a dream I had. Like, I remember it was right around the time that Todd in the Shadows had uploaded his episode on Skilo's I Wish, because I think I watched that video one night before I went to sleep and had the beat to that song, like, lodged in my head. But then I woke up the next morning, I had something stuck in my head that sounded like the beat to I Wish, and still sounded like vaguely 70s-ish, but the melody and chord progression was totally different, and since I couldn't recognize it belonging to any tune in particular that I knew already existed, I just immediately ran over to FL Studio to try and transcribe the new chord progression that was looping through my head before I had even gotten coffee or breakfast. Waking up with an original tune in my head is not something that happens to me very often, maybe like once or twice a year if that, so all the more exciting when that does get pulled out of the ether like that. And it did happen twice, like the track's B section has a different chord progression that I came up with like the exact same way. I just woke up with a chord progression in my head and had to transcribe it. So I spliced these ideas together and had the structure of the idea I had in mind nailed down in like early 2023 before starting the other sessions. That's the above mentioned demo version I included on the 10 feet 6 inches EP. And at the time I included it, I was really happy with it. I knew it was gonna work as like the big emotional resolution at the end of the album, though it was also like a really simple tune I made in FL Studio, and as kind of alluded to earlier when I was talking about this album's title track, the simpler FL Studio tunes I made in the past that like utilized a certain MIDI piano VST that I liked using, those occasionally got some mixed reactions from people who pointed out the MIDI sound of that piano and is like a sticking point for them. So this track was like always in my back pocket. It was always definitely going to be the album closer, just melodically wouldn't have made sense to go anywhere else but the end of this album, but I was also like at this weird point with it where it was both never completely finished sounding to me, and yet I also didn't actually know what I could possibly add or tweak about it from the way I had it beyond like minor adjustments to the structure, maybe the addition of a guitar loop or two for texture. I was at one point considering playing the track on a real piano, since there is a piano place not too far from where I live. I started to learn it myself on my keyboard. Though I did run into the problem after that when I talked to someone who worked at that piano place. They told me very specifically they do not allow regular people to reserve practice rooms, whether paid or not. Pianos are for sale only, and the piano lessons they advertised on their website were only for small children 12 and under, so that was some fucking bullshit. Though thankfully, as mentioned before, I got the brand new piano VST instead that I could actually get much more convincingly to sound like a real piano. And while just replacing the VST outright didn't quite work at first, the point at which I was able to, actually finish the track wasn't until, all the way after I nailed down my first draft of Earthlight, since, that track had this fluttery piano melody to work with that I got from a sample loop. So as I was finishing that track, I thought up a brand new original piano melody that kind of loosely mirrored it, but would go over the chord progression I already had before. It was like that do-do-do-do-do-do. And from there, I just recreated the whole track from scratch. Resequenced all the pianos with the same melody, readjusted them so that they would sound more like pianos and less obviously like VSTs through making the variations in volume and timing between notes. And from there, it was like everything just finally clicked into place. And from there, I just kept going. I got more guitar loops and stuff I could chop up to fit with the tune to make it sound even more organic. I got some, kind of hip-hop-ish break beats that made the track sound more like what was in my head when I first streamed up the tune. The track's new final climax initially felt a little underpowered compared to the initial demo, so I went through my giant pack of guitar sample loops and came across this soaring guitar solo that absolutely went off and even fit perfectly into the chord progression after some fairly minor editing. When I first heard the way those sounds all came together with that last guitar solo on top, I was legit kind of getting myself to cry a bit, maybe. And then for the very final touch was sprinkling in a couple more voicemails for my phone to put in the background, kind of echoing what I did on Hydrologic Outlook and my parts of Dangerous Curve. But the voicemails I used on this track have a little bit more meaning, since they're all from my grandmother. Now, my grandmother is alive and well, actually doing really well for her age, and constantly staying active to an impressive degree. One would guess she's at least 10 years younger than she really is. My family comes over to visit her, and she cooks us dinner once a week. The contents of the voicemails I included are obviously pretty innocuous, just her wondering if scheduling is going to work out for certain get-togethers at her place or special occasions or whatever, and one where she got worried during a big rainstorm and left a message for me to make sure that we were all holding up okay. And I wanted to include her voice in the track since I feel really lucky that we still have her around and doing as well as she is. Keeping in mind that the track will take on new meaning whenever the time comes that we don't have her around anymore, but also the fact that she is still around is, kind of a light in the dark too. Ties directly into the life-affirming reminder that I wanted the track to be when I first came up with the title. Also, the way I used the voicemails and the way the entire final track was put together was all pretty directly inspired by this one obscure album I have long held as an all-time favorite, Memories from a Fading Room by Future Loop Foundation. That whole album utilized spoken interviews, I think, from various elderly people throughout, in kind of a similar way that I use my grandmother's voicemail on this track. And the track The Sea in the Sky in particular had this absolutely massive post-rock climax that made me feel things I didn't know electronic music could make me feel back when I first heard it in high school, so yeah, I guess this ended up being me trying to make my own equivalent to that specific track. Maybe some subconscious influence from BT's Good Morning Kaya as well. And yeah, the final result is probably my personal favorite track on this album overall, and I think just might be my new favorite track I've ever made, beating out Primavera and Cotangent. I've just felt like coming back to it and listening to it out of context so many times over the course of this year alone when I'm feeling down and in need of some musical hope, and it's kept hitting, even after hitting a slight bit of overplay threshold with the rest of the album over the course of this year. But even that's not quite the end of the story either. There's one last piece to mention. I knew I was going to do a very limited CD run for this album, so I thought, hey, how about I do that little gimmick that CDs used to do where there's an unlisted hidden track at the end. Now, that's a gimmick that is not always aged well. Sometimes it translates to, like, oh, you get an 18-minute track actually being, like, a 4-minute track with 12 minutes of silence and, like, 10 seconds of sound effects at the end, which is an absolute fucking tease in the digital and streaming era. But sometimes if the silence is short enough and the hidden track hits well enough, it can end up holding up anyway. So what I ended up doing for the CD hidden track was, like, reach back all the way to some of my very earliest exposures with electronic music at all, and specifically with this CD called Energizing, that once came as a bonus gift that came pre-packaged with Tilex shower cleaner, and I played it all the time when I was like 9 or 10. There's so much nostalgia attached to the material from this CD, even though none of the artists who actually made it are credited on it. Only a special thanks to Sarah Gilbert and Elizabeth Cantlin, who may or may not have had anything to do with the recording of the music. I have no idea. At least one track on there has popped up on, like, another compilation out there and credited under someone else's name, but I don't know. I don't think there's any way to directly confirm all of it that I know of. Point is, I decided to make a cover version of a bunch of tracks from that CD. I meshed together a medley of my 4 favorite tracks from there, being the tracks Safari, Horizon, Escape to Paradise, and I Call Your Name. The former of those has some special memories with my other grandmother on the other side of my family, who is no longer with us. She passed away, like, when I was still a kid. But she did live to see some of my obsession with that CD, and I remember playing it for her. And I remember, like, I was asking her, like, what's your favorite track on this CD? And she picked Safari as her favorite track, so that's always just going to stick in my mind, I think. By the way, for a free CD of new age music that came packaged with shower cleaner, these compositions are surprisingly musically sophisticated, and it was way more difficult for me to recreate the melodies and chord progressions in my own DAW than one might expect. There's like a bunch of like tricky jazz chords in there that were pretty tough to figure out, especially working purely by ear in the way I had to. Like I had to like do a bunch of like EQing of the original tracks and like tap out notes until it felt right, and then there was just some like weird harmonies that were just not what I expected. There was like one chord that had like a minor second in it, and like, wow, really? But yeah, I managed to pull it off anyway. All the respect to whoever wrote those original songs. There's a good reason that CD is still as special to me as it still is to this day. And while my version of those tracks is mostly pretty faithful to how the tracks already originally sounded, I did bring in my own spin on them through, like, you know, both the way I segued the elements together, mashed them up, and added in some break beats and field recordings and the like. The hidden track in question is not on Bandcamp or streaming services, but I did make it publicly available on YouTube after the CD sold out, so you can find that on the 256 Pi Music channel as well. So, with that hidden track finished around Thanksgiving of last year, I finally felt like the album was now finished and ready to put out there in the world. Now, I assumed this probably wasn't going to be getting that much attention, probably more attention than other stuff I've released in the past, you know, purely thanks to my audience being bigger than it was 5 years ago. But I thought it is probably not going to be by that much. People are going to be like, yeah, this is a thing that exists, I guess, like they were with the last album, and I can just be content at the fact that I finally have this work out there and that it's as good as I can possibly make it within my current abilities. And I gotta say, I was not at all prepared for the response I got when the album finally came out. I mean, it wasn't like blowing up or crossing over to people outside the usual circles I follow and stuff, but I was really caught off guard both by the volume of people who were giving it the time of day. Not only did the CD nearly sell out before the album even came out in full, but I think more people have purchased this album on Bandcamp than all of the other releases I have up on that site combined. But I was also really caught off guard by the level of positivity I was getting as well. Like, this album actually got a level of praise I feel like I've never gotten before. It became, like, near universally agreed upon as my best work to date, like, almost right out of the gate, and I saw lots of people tell me they properly loved the album. People's favorite tracks were also my favorite tracks, like The Natural Path and Primavera and Anything Not Safe Will Be Lost and Dangerous Curve. But also every track felt like it was at least someone's favorite. On top of that, the two fellow review channels I follow the most closely and interact with the most, Spectrum Pulse and Not Real Music, they went out of their way to make short reviews for the album without me even asking, and both of them were pretty glowing. I even made the cut for both of their mid-year lists. I am writing and recording this video before year-end list season really kicks in, but there's a pretty decent chance I end up on those as well. And even if I don't, the praise I have already gotten from them and other people has genuinely left me at a loss for words. Now, as to be somewhat expected, some of the compliments I've gotten were also kind of backhanded. I might have seen a comment or two to the effect of, "Oh yeah, you actually sound like a real artist now instead of a low-rent wannabe." Or even "Oh hey, you've actually made some music that's actually worth listening to for the first time in your life." But I guess I will take the fact that I was, winning over former naysayers with this thing. And even the people who I saw that weren't as keen on the album were saying things like, "Oh, I just don't like ambient or electronic music of the styles this guy likes to begin with," or maybe, "Oh, it's too polished," or "It's too traditional sounding and thereby doesn't have enough unique personality for my liking." Which, I wasn't even really trying to reinvent the wheel at any point, and I was trying to polish everything up as much as I could, so this just still feels like personal taste things and not like a "you are objectively bad at music" kind of thing. So if stuff like this is the biggest criticisms that people are levying at it, that feels pretty validating in and of itself, honestly. Obviously pleasing everyone is a fool's errand. The only decision that I made around this album, which was meant to please my audience's sensibilities rather than my own, was just the decision to keep it under an hour. Other than that, I made this album for me to get me through a tough time in my life, and I was honestly just shocked at just how high a percentage of my audience was actually pleased by the results. Putting out an album and not only watching it get so much more attention than any of my other stuff, but also more acclaim, seeing people much more positive on it than anything I've ever done before, I was just not ready for that, man. The album could, stop getting attention for the rest of eternity tomorrow, and the reception I have already gotten for this album has just exceeded all of my absolute wildest expectations. Now, I do admittedly feel like I'm going to also need some proper distance from this album before I'm able to say how it stacks up next to my other albums in terms of, personal enjoyment. Obviously I do think it is, one of my very best works. Certainly my best produced album by a long shot. It's the one I put the most work into by quite a distance as well. Is this the album that carries the most personal meaning to me, though? That is hard to say when I also have 8 others that also mean a lot to me personally. Yeah, I've got a lot more technical ability when it comes to producing this kind of stuff now, but technical ability isn't everything either. I was a lot more high on New Tide Attic Drifter when that came out than I was on this album when it came out. Here there was also more of just a sense of relief that it was just finally out after such a long time with, again, that slight bit of personal overplay setting in, not to mention, like 04, this whole thing is directly associated with a not so good time in my life, where I felt like everything was falling apart. But on the other hand, that also kind of unintentionally ended up making the mission of this album a lot more relevant after it came out, as fascists took over the country, I guess. Because now I just get the reminder every day that it is not just everything on the verge of falling apart for me on a personal level. It is extended outwards to all but the ruling class in the country that I live in, and pretty much most of the entire world as well. And a lot of people are doing a hell of a lot worse than I am, both before this year, when I was doing bad, and even more since then, obviously. I feel like the need for an affirmation to keep just going on living is gone up a lot more. The need for a reminder that there is still some beauty left in the world and that we need to protect it and not give up on life yet and let the bad guys win. That maybe it just took touching a bit of grass and going outside a little more literally in my case to be able to see where that light is a bit more easily, as corny as all of that may be to observe, I guess. But if someone is able to get that affirmation from me, then that makes it all the more worth it even more. I don't know what my next album is going to sound like. I imagine it's going to sound different from this album, but I have no idea to what extent it'll be different, since I haven't actually started any work on it or given it much thought yet. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you for all the support y'all have given me with this album. It may not look like much to some people, but it is frankly way more than I ever could have asked for. So, yeah, thank you. And thank you as well to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, a link to my Patreon is in the description. But, yeah, that's pretty much it. So, that's all for today. See you next time.